Welcome, everyone. I'm Leslie Orloff. I direct the National Immigrant Women's Advocacy Project at American University, Washington College of Law. And we are very excited to have you join us for this really important presentation today. Let's put science first, assessing predatory helpfulness and coercive control to more accurately understand domestic abuse and sex trafficking. This is a presentation that will be incredibly helpful, I think, to all of us, victim advocates, attorneys, judges, in the work that we do with immigrant survivors. And it will help not only in the family law context and contested custody and divorce cases, where I'm really excited about what we're going to be hearing today and what it means for those cases, but also for those of you that are doing work with immigrant survivors on immigration cases. All of what you're going to hear today will help survivors prove extreme cruelty in immigration cases. And so it's equally helpful for that, as Judge Sarita will be talking about as well, and the impact on criminal cases. So this has broad impact for all of us that are working with survivors. So I am just a little introduction. I started my career as a family lawyer. I was the first family lawyer who spoke Spanish, who knew what a protection order was in Washington, D.C., and represented all of the battered immigrant women in D.C. through a program that I founded at IUTA back in 1983. Well, I started doing this work in 83. And did a lot of contested cases, domestic violence cases of all kinds in family court, where I wish I had access to the kind of information we're going to get today. And as I said, as somebody who was involved in drafting the U visa, the VAWA self-petition, parts of special immigrant juvenile status, the kinds of information that you're going to hear today are going to be really, really helpful for those of you that are working with survivors on immigration cases. So I'm going to turn it over to Judge Sarita.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Toko Sarita, and I am the statewide coordinating judge for problem-solving courts in New York State. I am also a problem-solving court judge. I have a drug court, mental health court, and a human trafficking intervention court in Queens County. We deal with misdemeanor cases. It is in my capacity as a human trafficking intervention court judge that I know Dr. Chitra Raghavan. I have been involved in that court since 2008. And I have to say that, that Dr. Raghavan has developed like an incredible body of work that really supports and assists our understanding of human trafficking survivors. In addition to her visionary work, she is a real innovator and incredibly charismatic. We had a two-day training about two years ago in New York City, and I cannot tell you the number of fangirls who were in the audience as a result of her lecture. People could have stayed for hours listening to her. So I know that you will all get a lot out of this presentation today. Dr. Raghavan is a full professor of psychology at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, City University of New York, and also the director of the Forensic Mental Health Counseling Program. She created and oversees the Advanced Certificate of Victim Studies and the Victim Track specialization contained within the Forensic Mental Health Counseling degree. She conducts research on power dynamics, that is coercive control, and intimate partner abuse, sexual assault, sex trafficking, and cult contexts, as well as related traumatic outcomes. She's currently working on a book with Oxford University Press, which intends to render coercive control assessments accessible to law enforcement, legal personnel, and mental health professionals. She is a practicing psychologist and is deemed an expert by the courts in intimate partner violence, sex trafficking, coercive control, trauma, and trauma bonding. So I want to introduce you to Dr. Raghavan, who will be speaking shortly. Leslie, go ahead.
Yes. So Okay, the next slide. So this is, we want to thank our sponsors. This is sponsored by the Office on Violence Against Women at the U.S. Department of Justice and the State Justice Institute, and is co-sponsored by the National Judicial Network. And so I want to thank, but the views you're going to hear today are those of us as speakers and not necessarily reflecting the views of either the State Justice Institute or the Department of Justice.
All right. So I just wanted to say a few words about joining the National Judicial Network, which was started in 2021. It's a forum on human trafficking and immigration in state courts. There are currently 304 judges from 41 states and U.S. jurisdictions. The National Judicial Network provides judges with an opportunity to engage in discussions with other judges, receive latest information, peer-to-peer training opportunities, and we also get your questions answered, right? You can receive this information that you need through webinars, trainings, technical assistance, bench cards, tools, and training materials. I am on the advisory committee of the National Judicial Network, and I encourage everybody who's out there today to sign up immediately. Judicial officers who want to join the National Judicial Network can look at the link that is there in order to register. All right, so we're expecting you to join.
Thank you so much, Judge. And those of you that are attorneys in the audience, if you work with judges in your courts that you think would be interested in joining the network, please share this information with them. There'll be a link to a welcome letter and a sign up. There's more information about the network on a webpage that we'll share with you when we do the follow-up email to all of you. So please, both judges, I encourage you to sign up, and judicial officers who are on the call, but on the webinar, but also lawyers, if you know judges you think would be interested in engaging with other judges on these issues, please send them our way. And for family lawyers and victim advocates and people that work in law enforcement and prosecutors' offices who are on the call, we also have a community of practice that we can offer to you. Our family law community practice has been meeting, oh my goodness, I think 7 or 8 years now, for quite a long time. The victim advocate community practice is one of our newer ones. It's been meeting for like 2 years now. And our law enforcement and prosecutor roundtables, which is open to law enforcement officers, prosecutors, and system-based victim advocates. So people that work at the law enforcement and prosecution agencies are able to join that call as well. These are the links. We'll send them to you in the follow-up email as well to the webinar. So we encourage you, and these are all peer-to-peer learning opportunities, much like what Judge Sarita described of what we offer to the judges. We also offer them to family lawyers, victim advocates, and law enforcement prosecution staff. So we're going to start with a poll. You've heard a little bit about who we are, and you're going to be hearing in a moment from Dr. Raghavan. But I want to, our first poll is to get a sense of who's on this call with us, who you are and where you're coming from professionally. So we're running the polls. Okay, I'm going to give it a few more moments. It looks like about 67% of you have responded. This is great. And where's the poll? Oh, there we go. Thank you. So the results are, it looks like about 8% of you are judges or court staff, 51% are victim service providers, 19% attorneys, 3% of you work in law enforcement and prosecution agencies, and about 20% of you have other professions. And I'm seeing accredited representatives, youth advocates, shelter managers, federal employees, court educators, therapists, epidemiologists, so child welfare. So it sounds like we have a really good mix of attendees today, and thank you all for joining us. Okay, so now I gotta stop and go to, okay. I'm going to turn the presentation over to our distinguished faculty member here, Dr. Raghavan.
Thank you so much, Leslie and Judge Sarita. I'm so happy to be here. It's such an exciting group, and we've had so much fun, if that's the right word, enthusiasm, spirit in organizing this together. And it makes, and when you have this many people, I realize that so many of us care about the same thing, and that's just such a good feeling. I want to do a quick shout out to people hiding in the audience who are absolutely relevant to this talk and this research. Somewhere hidden in the audience is Tatum Kenny, who was my master's student, who became interested in predatory helpfulness. And together we've worked on 2 studies. Her master's will be published soon. Tatum, after years of working with me, decided that she does not want to be a psychologist, but wants to be a lawyer. So a loss to me in a playful way, and a wonderful benefit to the lawyers out there. So I want to shout out to Tatum. This wouldn't have happened without her. And somewhere hidden in the audience are several of my students and former students who helped me do this research, and who often take important leads in it, are active contributing members to my thinking. So this sort of thing doesn't happen alone. It happens when people work collaboratively. And that's really what I wanted to say, acknowledge my wonderful students. So the broad theme of today is there is a gap between victim experience and what the system measures. And something that I've been trying to do for many, many years is how can we close that gap in an efficient way? So part of, I'm clicking on the wrong button. So another way to ask this question is, how do we map the experience of someone, the violent experience of someone, in a way that's also useful for the law? And what we know is that assessments that exist today, most of the assessments that exist today, are really reflecting either a forensic psychology lens or a criminal justice lens, and they're set up to be useful for criminal justice and psychologist practitioners. But the more useful they are for practitioners, the further this gets away from the experience of the victim. And this is a problem because it doesn't represent the lived experience of the victim. And that is a bigger problem because what we're creating inadvertently is a gap between the information that we're gathering and what really happened to her. Now, this isn't just about sort of the moral stance of representing voice. It's also that the stronger the victim's story, the closer to what she experienced or he or they experienced, the more credibility she has. But also the judiciary and can respond in a way that is far more accurate. So my talk has 3 objectives, and one is to introduce the importance of context, which I call timeline. The second is to emphasize that when we think of what is abuse, what is coercive control, what is exploitation, I want us to stay with this sort of narrow confine, which is exploitation abuse happens because the abuser wants the victim to obey or to stay. To obey, and obeys on a spectrum of do what I want you to do, to stay with me in the way I want you to stay with me. Second, which is frequently missing from the way we think about the goal of abuse, is the abuser needs to be correct. He needs to be validated as correct to himself, so in his own private thinking universe, but also by the victim, and importantly by the outside world, which leads to a fundamental core of most abuse. It needs to be deceptive. In order for the abuser to be correct, his abuse needs to be deceptive. So please keep this in mind. I'll skip that point. It's just sort of asking, well, why does it have to be that way? Okay, so how you measure the abuse dynamic, however you measure it, I measure it as coercive control and in different contexts, ultimately is really what sets the basis for victim credibility. And the question I want to sort of put out to you and for you to ask yourself over and over again is, are you detecting the nuances of the more invisible elements of abuse? If you don't ask this question, you probably are not detecting subtle abuse. So why are we at this crossroad? Because historically, IPV was defined as a relationship with physical and psychological aggression. In recent times, sexual has popped in. But more importantly, in most jurisdictions, most researchers measure IPV as something you count. How many times did he or she or they hit you? How many times did he strangle you, punch you, threaten you? And count it up. And the higher the numbers, the more severe the IPV. There is never any attention to context, and there is almost no attention to was there deception early in the relationship. Why is this problematic? Because we're missing data in the simplest, most research of terms, and what we're actually missing are the nuances of abuse. And this leads to very serious outcomes. We misclassify perpetrators and victims. When we see women using violence defensively with male abusers, we think it's bidirectional. We have been very dismissive of same-sex violence if we detect it. And we misclassify incidents that are not at all minor for the victim as very minor, which often misses the whole context or the dangerousness of the abuse. And ultimately, if data is missing, the violence is invisible to community, to friends, to police, and as I'll talk about shortly, invisible sometimes to the victim herself or themselves. So there's a long tradition in psychiatry and psychology, which is a whole other talk, where women in sexual minorities are seen as hysterical, neurotic, overwrought, irrational, terrible storytellers, illogical, hostile, liars. And what's the evidence? Well, the evidence is that story makes no sense. You can see the vicious cycle, the loop, where we don't ask the right questions, her story doesn't make sense, and the conclusion is, well, she's either hysterical or lying, right? She's not credible. And then questions like this start to pop up. Well, why did she stay? Or if the abuse was so bad, why didn't he report it to the police? Why didn't they speak to close friends? And I get this all the time. I work on lots of cases where parties ask, why do you disclose it so late in the investigation? Maybe it didn't happen. Maybe you made it up. And so, these kinds of things are real life questions that happen when you don't believe your victim because your story is not complete.
So we're now going to do another poll. So have you had cases where victims behaved in ways that didn't make sense? So if you think about what Dr. Raghavan was just saying, have you experienced this in some of your cases as you listen to her describe some of the context and the importance of context? So we're going to give it a few minutes or a few seconds. We're going to wait until we reach about half. Right now we're at about 40%. About 10, give you 10 more seconds. 10, 9, 8. Okay, let's share the results. And so 49% of you are saying that, yes, it didn't make sense, that you found it didn't make, wasn't comprehensible to you. 37% of you have said you've had cases where it didn't make sense to the judge. And 72% of you have said it didn't make sense to others. And then a few of you haven't had that experience. For those of you that said it didn't make sense to others, you want to type in or do I have the next one? If you could type it in the chat, that would be great. And we can get a sense of what what some of the examples of that are. And in the meantime, while that's coming in, we're going to do one more poll. Okay, so some of you are saying law enforcement, prosecution, the survivor's family and friends. That's a very common one. Juries, DHS caseworkers, the guardian ad litem in a case, Department of Children and Family Services, law enforcement, GALs, All of the above. Okay, so that gives us a nice picture of what kind of the impact of it can be. To you visa certifiers, that is totally true. Corrections officers. Okay, so we're going to do another poll. Oh, good. Thank you, Brianne, for putting it up. Which of the following has happened in your cases? The survivors returned to the abuser, delayed reporting, did not reveal sexual assault until much later in the case, was forced to do criminal acts, or other, and then type in the chat. Okay, people are saying recantation. We've got about 49% of you responding now. Some of you are saying all of the above. Okay. Another 10, another 5 seconds, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We're going to share the results. And that what we're seeing here is that 90% of them, victims, had experiences where they were returning to the abuser, delayed reporting, 79%, not revealing sexual assault until much later, 74%, and 49% were forced to do criminal acts. And that they withdrew petitions, there was trauma and drug abuse. Trying to think if I've captured most of them. Okay. I'm going to turn it back to Dr. Raghavan.
Thank you. That was fascinating to see what you've experienced. I want to say something perhaps a little radical. I feel that, the way in which we're measuring is ultimately bad science, and because bad science is when you're not capturing the reality of the victim. And so bad science is sustaining hostility against women and queer victims. And to add to that, I think something that's really important. Oops, sorry. Struggling a little bit about how to move we're all moving the slide remotely.
No, I wasn't trying to.
Let's think about, for example, let's say, someone, a client perhaps, or yourself, and you've just been conned of several $100,000. When your case is being investigated, it is unlikely that the judiciary or anyone assigned to your case will say, I need you to prove to me that you are actually conned. I need you to seem trustworthy. I need you to show me all the ways in which you know the law, where you can prove to me that the things that you did were actually illegal by law. No, people ask questions, take notes, figure out how to get the data in order to prosecute the case. But when we work with gender-based survivors, we ask them to tell the story. If we don't like the story, we're like, well, I don't think we have enough facts to prosecute. We drop the case, right? But why is it that the burden of establishing abuse is with the victim in gender-based violence? It should be with the evaluator. Whether the evaluator is myself, law enforcement, a lawyer, a prosecutor, a defense lawyer, it should be with the person who's gathering data. And so I think we really need to have a shift here and start to understand that if her story doesn't make sense, we're not asking it right. So how do we narrow this gap? It's a lot. The problem is profound and complex, but the solution is actually quite simple. The first thing we should do is get the relationship history, which we routinely do not. And what do I mean by the relationship history? And then the second was measure coercive control. So relationship history is historically, when we do the initial interview, we ask questions like, when did you meet? When did things go wrong? Which is reasonable. When did he, she, they first use violence? And when did the coercive control start? These are reasonable questions. And to be fair, it's better to ask them than not ask them at all. But why is this problematic? Because what people experience, typically women, what they're experiencing in the early part of their relationship is affection. So when you ask them, how do you, when did things go wrong? That doesn't quite match up, because what's really happening is they're experiencing lots of affection or intent to help, to provide a solution to barriers. Could be any number of things. What's happening at the beginning is a sense of connection. And often when asked about coercion, what survivors report is he, she, or they were very, very intense, but not openly controlling. I didn't feel controlled, just very intense, right? So the experience of the victim is not mapping on to the way we're asking questions. So we miss what really happened. What should we ask? What I find very useful is this model proposed by Basra. She developed it in sex trafficking survivors. And she suggests that we look at the initial stages, whether it's sex trafficking, sexual harassment in more civil cases, sexual assault by an acquaintance or a friend, partner violence, of course, as grooming or seduction, if you're thinking about partner violence. And she uses the term predatory helpfulness. So the wrong question to ask, I suggest, is something that puts the burden on the victim to define as violence. The moment right at the beginning is obscured by deception. She doesn't really know that coercion has begun or is about to begin or is in full swing. What we should do is replace it with assessments of deception. She sees intense affection, for example. What do we see? What do we need to see? And it's possible that there actually only was intense affection. I'm not saying that, we should become so suspicious that no relationship starts with genuine affection. But if you see something else, then that's what you ask. But you ask about it in a way where she doesn't have to define it as coercion. Why is this important? The extent to which there was more deception, the more invisible the coercive control is, and the less able she is to recognize abuse, less able to pinpoint when it became abusive. If she doesn't know there was abuse, how does she know when it began till it becomes serious? This is sort of the problem of delayed reporting or didn't talk about it till much later. But also, there's a lot of deception, often the victims never identify the abuse at the beginning. And if they cannot identify the abuse, their story is weak, the story is unreliable. You'll notice that if you interview victims many times, the story changes. This is actually a good thing. What's happening is the layers of deception are peeling off like an onion. And they're like, oh, wait. Oh, wait, I didn't tell you that. That was abuse. And they start remembering it. So it's actually about peeling off the deception. Now, the willingness to report, which is a very important issue, is how much internal clarity do you have? In other words, do you believe you were abused? Is it very clear to you that what happened was abuse? If it's not clear to you, you're not going to put your reputation and his life or their life at risk by reporting. So the more you help the victim realize there was deception which led to abuse, the more likely it is that she's going to report and that her story is clearer. Less likely that she self-blames. And there's always going to be loyalty and ambivalence, which goes hand in hand with internal clarity. Did it really happen? But over time, if you as the evaluator or us as the evaluators help guide the victim to identifying the deception, the clarity becomes stronger and the ambivalence will get weaker. So what are the stages of grooming? Like how do we think about this efficiently? Give me a second to sip water. I propose this as a heuristic to help people figure out how they want to go about their own evaluations. So what happens at the early stages of any relationship is there's all kinds of different ways in which people are affectionate, people are helpful, people are supportive, people are making connections. And in this particular study that I'm citing that both Basra and Tatum Kenny were on, in a group of survivors, what they found was love bombing predominated. So most of the women in this group reported that early on, what their abusers did is tell them that they were amazing, that they had never met anybody like them, they had never experienced anything so intense or beautiful. They didn't think they could ever feel it again, that this was the dream woman they were waiting for, and that they wanted to be with her every minute of the day because all this time had been lost, that they didn't ever want to be separated, that she didn't need anybody else because this was perfect love. And this went on and on and on for about 6 weeks to 3 months, at the end of which, whether or not she was reluctant, nervous, or puzzled at the beginning, most of the women felt madly in love at the end of this period. As significant number of women, here's a quote, a little bit of what I just said. I was crazy about him. He was romantic, kind, thought he was too good to be true. And the issue really is here is the attention that's very intense, over the top, and positive. Substantial number of women, and we were surprised by this, told us that they got some kind of financial aid. A large part of it was housing. And so they were offered a place to stay, some kind of shelter, and they took it because they were homeless or soon to be homeless. So for example, this one client was at a DV shelter and felt that, she had been saved from homelessness. A substantial number of women did drugs with their abuser, who had slowly become their pimp, and they felt ashamed, they felt lost, they felt afraid, they weren't quite sure how to quit, and they felt that rather than see the abuser as an enabler, they saw the abuser as helpful and kind. So again, if you asked, did he abuse you in any way, you would get a no, because their experience of him was he helped them when they needed drugs. And quite a few said that they felt emotionally supported, connected. He offered himself as a family member, not a lover. He took care of them. He, made all sorts of statements that made them feel warm and loved and safe. And the issue really is they felt safe. They were craving safety in such a deep way that the support that he provided made them feel like, he's such a cool guy, he's such a sweetheart, and that they were going to be a team. So when you do your evaluations or your initial report, consider exploring, was there predatory helpfulness or deception, if any? And at the end of this talk, I'm going to provide a list of questions that survivors developed with us, all of whom were deceived and then later trafficked, but consider exploring it also in your own way. And then think about, what was the moment where the love bombing, the help, the support, the connection stopped? And he said, in this case, you have to sell sex because we're out of money. I'm going to leave you. You owe me money for drugs. I don't have money for next month's rent. Or in domestic and intimate partner relationships, giving the cold shoulder, saying maybe we're not the right ones, maybe we shouldn't be with each other, or you need to leave this house, right? So when did the flip start and the coercion begin? Women can almost always identify survivors. What form did it take? How did the exploitation manifest? Was he cold? What we found in now 2 studies, overwhelmingly, again, to our counterintuitive surprise, is the abuser had almost never hit the women the first 3 months. He had been sweet, seductive, we thought very jealous, controlling, but she didn't. And then at the moment that he made the request, her response was, I don't want to do it. He gave her the cold shoulder. He stopped talking to her. He, sometimes just stopped talking to her, didn't do anything else, just absolutely cold for days at a time. She went into a complete panic and gave in. Again, if you assess this as was he violent, you would get no and you'd move on. He wasn't violent, so she wasn't exploited. But what we actually found was a whole period of deception followed by different kinds of manipulative moments to get her to give in. And then in hindsight, does she recognize the deception to be coercive? Some do, some don't. And number 4 is not always necessary for court at the moment, but it helps victims gain inner clarity, which will help their testimony. And I asked myself throughout this, I've done maybe 200-300 clinical assessments, many, many more for research. Did I ask the question correctly? What am I missing? Did I ask it correctly? What am I not picking up? What should I do better? That sort of thing. And this is our job. I'm going to say this ad nauseum, not the victims, right? This is our job to do correctly. So steps to narrow the gap, get the relationship history. It takes 10 minutes if you're efficient, 20 minutes if you're like me. Measure coercive control, not just discrete acts of abuse, which I'll get into in a minute. And let me stop there.
Okay. So we're going to do another quick poll. Have you worked in a case with victims whose romantic partner or trafficker provided, we're going to go back to some of the things that Dr. Raghavan was talking about, financial support, housing, access to drugs or money for drugs, emotional support. And then again, please type other types of things that were offered in the chat: childcare, food, clothing, immigration petition, a job, to rescue her from an immigration situation that was at risk, transportation. That's a big one we're seeing a lot of, actually. To split the rent, they paid the smuggler's fees, childcare, a lot of childcare, save the pets, legal status, immigration status, and then the love bombing, a green card. Okay. And in the poll results, let's end the poll. And what we're seeing here is 91% of you have said financial support, another 91 housing. The access to drugs and money for drugs is 58%, emotional support 69%, and then 16% other, and those are coming in. And people are now mentioning things like offered to support the family, to keep the family unit together, those kinds of things. Great. And escaping an abusive past or family. I know I've seen that in a bunch of my cases. So I think the next question is like how useful this information is in domestic violence or human trafficking trials. I'll start and then maybe Judge Sarita can follow me. So certainly I litigated a lot of contested domestic violence, contested protection order, contested custody cases. And I've worked over the years, many of you know from our community of practice, supporting family lawyers all over the country that are doing just that. And I would argue that gathering this kind of information, either yourself or getting an evaluator to help you, would be super important to documenting and explaining to the judge in these domestic violence cases, and some of them overlap with human trafficking, what the full dynamics of abuse are that your client has experienced. It could also include things like stalking. I mean, there could be all kinds of things that I think this kind of questioning and approach would be super helpful for in family law cases. And although the question doesn't ask it, also describing power and control to immigration adjudicators in VAWA self-petitioning and U visa cases. Judge Sarita?
Sure. I want to go beyond just talking about criminal court and talk about the court system as a whole, especially when we're talking about trafficking victims, because I think one of the biggest problems is the issue of identification, right? Normally, trafficking victims are so invisible and under the radar that it is very difficult for people to really understand or identify where they are, who they are. In many instances, as Dr. Raghavan was talking about before, these victims don't self-identify as trafficking victims. They don't even acknowledge or are aware of the abuse that they are experiencing, especially with their traffickers. And so I think that the issue of identification is so critical. For us in New York State, for example, law enforcement has stopped arresting people on prostitution charges, right? So we don't have as many individuals in our trafficking intervention courts. And for that reason, it becomes all the more important to really understand and really see that many of these individuals will remain below the surface. And it is so important for not only judges, but everybody who comes into contact with these potential, individuals to really start asking the right questions.
Absolutely. It really, and I can't say how much I agree with Judge Sarita that it is so important to kind of take this information and use it so that people can come forward and get the help they need from our agencies and because without identifying this kind of coercion and predatory helpfulness, we're not able to help them navigate towards all the relief that a court may be able to offer, our programs may be able to offer, et cetera.
Thank you. That was so interesting. I do want to say my lab and I are now looking at how predatory helpfulness may play out in relationships that will become coercive. And so some of your answers have been very helpful. We don't know. We know about love bombing. We know it happens a great deal. We don't know how other forms of support are offered to vulnerable individuals that later on make it hard for them to leave. So that was exciting to see. Before I get into what coercive control is and why measure it, let me talk briefly about why it's worth measuring. It's difficult to measure. It takes much more time than counting up how many times he, she, or they hit you or yelled at you or pushed you. But I think it's worth it. And the most important reason really in a broad level is it's a very sensitive measure of abuse. And it gives you a better theoretical framework to understand why certain things happen, including why he used sexual violence or why he just yelled the second time but didn't hit. It also accounts for queer violence in a very sensitive, gendered way, which we've not been able to do with the older feminist theories upon which I heavily rely. But this really lets us push it further and deeper. And ultimately, it provides a really solid framework to explain some of the incomprehensible behaviors that all of us shared with each other, not reporting, returning to abuser. And it is a very good predictor of a wide variety of traumatic outcomes in a clinical way. And ultimately, it continues to narrow the gap between what happened to the victim and what we need to know, which then makes her a more credible witness. So what is it? It is at the broadest level a power dynamic that is continuously exploited. And the continuous is important because what coercive control is it's like a river or an electric current that's flowing. It's not individual acts of hitting and then there's no violence. He hits her and then there's no violence. He yells at her and then everything goes back to normal. The way you want to think about it is that's like an unpleasant electrical current running through her life. And most days she feels it, but it doesn't hurt. But if she doesn't do something he wants her to do, or if she's getting too independent, he raises the voltage and it shocks her, stuns her into paralysis and obedience, and then it goes back down. So it's really sort of how abuse operates. Constant low grade with occasional paralyzing and damaging shocks. It's dynamic, and what that means is it's ongoing, as I just described, but it also goes around and it makes other tactics more powerful, or it auto-catalyzes other tactics. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. Importantly, I think we should, if there's only one thing you get from this presentation, please get this, which is the end goal. What is the end goal of coercive control? Why does he use it? What is his intent? What does he want to achieve? I had said it earlier. He wants her to be obedient. And obedience could be obedient, give me sex when I want it in the way that I want it, or obedience and stay with me and submit to me in the way that I want you to stay with me. So the ultimate goal is obedience. We can call it dependency, submission. She stays. But the second, equally important, is that he's validated as correct. Why is that important? Because only one person can be correct in this algorithm. If he's correct, she's incorrect, therefore unreliable, therefore lying. So he uses abuse for two reasons. Or the end goal is that she obeys him while acknowledging and validating that he is correct to have done what he has done, right? So, and this is sort of the more, I think, the more fundamental way of understanding of power exploitation. To give you a bird's eye view of coercion, I talked about the continuity of tactics. The abuser, during the early relationship history that we talked about, where he's love bombing her, offering her connection and help, and gets privileged knowledge of what really frightens her, What does she need? Well, she has a job. She needs to keep it. She doesn't have transportation. She needs to keep her job or she goes back to jail, but who's going to take care of the kids? She doesn't have money. He figures out quickly what is her vulnerability. Coercion is also pervasive. It's not situational. This sort of links back to the tactical acts. So we need to think about it as continuing in all domains of life. A shortcut to this is both public. Public might be work, with friends, and private. Private is in the house with no witnesses, but private is also frequently something we don't consider. Private is her mind. Abusers usurp the mind, the consciousness, the thinking, the reality of the victim in a way that, partners who are bad-tempered or have poor fighting skills do not. And so there's a pervasiveness in control. And tactics should be seen as things that are very obvious, like hitting, punching, screaming, public threats, versus invisible. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Micro-regulation, for example, or manipulation. And what makes something coercive, and this is tricky for the law, is context dependent. Something that's coercive for a woman might not be coercive for another woman. Something that's frightening for a gay man may not be frightening for a straight man. And so the effects of coercion and the intensity of the tactics have sort of interplay with the context. Very importantly for me and my students, how is coercion different from normative controlling behaviors? And it's a little bit of what I just said. Coercion targets all domains. Normative controlling behaviors are typically about the same thing. So maybe how you raise your children or the religion that you want to raise them in. Normative controlling behaviors end in fights, and both parties get to fight and resist. With coercion, there is no real negotiation or real resistance. In fact, what resistance leads to often is increased coercion, punishment, in different ways, obvious ways, non-obvious ways. So, obvious would be he yells more, he hits her. Not so obvious to the public might be he rapes her. And this is part of what makes it different from just unhealthy controlling behaviors, right? So it's pervasive. He doesn't allow for negotiation. If she tries to, it increases retaliation. So I'm going to talk about the way we, meaning my students and I, measure coercive control, and then I'm going to give you some examples. But I'm not going to go into every one of them in great detail because I think it'll be a little overwhelming. So for the purpose of just making our lives manageable, my students and I, both in research and clinical work, measure coercion using 8 tactics. The first is surveillance and stalking, isolation, micro-regulation, deprivation, degradation. I'll explain all of this in a minute. Intimidation, manipulation, sexual abuse. And when you think about these tactics, it might be useful for you just as an intellectual exercise to ask yourself, to what extent was this visible or invisible in my client's case? To what extent was this present in a way that she couldn't detect it, but it was the glue? You might also want to ask yourself, to what extent did it auto-catalyze other tactics, make other tactics more powerful? And then think about it also as, to what extent did these tactics loop together to suffocate her, slowly suffocate, paralyze, imprison her into obedience, and ultimately entrapment? So what is surveillance and stalking? It's essentially the idea that he is watching you in every sort of way. He's keeping tabs on you, whether it's using technology, so cell phones, cameras, GPS in the car, or physical stalking, showing up where you work, showing up at your family's house, driving past your apartment at all times of day. And what is the function of stalking or surveillance? The function really is to let her know that he has power over her in public space, private space. It's letting her know that she knows what she's doing, with whom she's doing. And so it starts to slowly shrink her autonomy in a very real way. It shrinks the reality in which she feels she can act. It shrinks the spheres in which she has agency. It's not just frightening her. It does frighten her, but it also cripples her autonomy. Surveillance frequently leads to isolation, and isolation can often just exist physically because For example, he might have been so seductive at the beginning. You don't need anybody else. I love you so much. Let's see each other day and night, day and night, day and night. And suddenly 3 months later, you don't have any friends. He might not threaten you about your friends, but he might embarrass you so much, like getting into fights, flinging glasses around, that you might just stop inviting people home, or you might not call them because he starts to speak loudly around you, right? So women and men can get isolated through means that actually don't look violent, but are very coercive. So again, seduction, pressure, just being a nuisance. And in many cases, they're already present. You may not speak the language. You may have moved with them. You may speak the language, but you move across the town and move across the city, country, and he doesn't let you make friends. I've had clients just move north, south of the same city and not have a car and be immediately cut off from immediate social support. So it might already be there. There's another kind of isolation that is really important that is not often measured, which is the isolating of the internal world. And it's super important, where the client starts to feel that nobody can help her. No one can understand her. No one can see her. No one will believe her. And the reason she starts to feel these things is in part because she's surveilled, is in part because how he manipulates her, is in part trauma. But this comes up often as an unexplained behavior. She was surrounded by family members. Why did she lie about him? She went to the police, but then she changed her mind. And a lot of this also has to do with internal clarity. If you're isolated in your own head, if you fear him because he has gotten into your head, you're going to be very cut off and mistrustful, which means you don't report, you don't disclose, you don't ask for help. And so this is super important to assess. Microregulation is micro and control. What do abusers control? They make constant, trivial, unpredictable demands. It is not the same as nagging. It is not the same as someone who's annoying. This is about dress the way I want, cook the way I want, wake up when I want, don't smile too much, look down when you walk, wear the kind of underwear I like, show up at the time that I want. Strict rules on tiny, tiny little things. But she can never get it right. And when she gets it right and when she doesn't get it right and when he's happy about it, keep changing. So she never knows. It's very unpredictable. And the unpredictability of it makes her anxious and nervous and more likely to be submissive. The important thing to remember about microregulation is it's slowly cutting off her ability to make small decisions. And the way we learn to be autonomous is we make small decisions, right? How should I wear my hair today? And then later on, how do I start a bank account where he can't find the money so I can leave? But if you can't make decisions about how to wear your hair, how are you going to scaffold up to the I need to open a bank account? And so this actually is so powerful. It's so invisible, but it zaps your autonomy and your agency. Deprivation is rarely measured. I've started only myself measuring it in the last 5 years. And it's when the abuser actively manipulates or blocks your access to shelter, money, and safety, which becomes hugely important, especially when he met you, promised you all these things, and or you have no other option. Abusers frequently wake up their victims in the middle of the night before court date, before an important job, before job meeting. And when they go into work or court, they are not able to function because they're too tired. I've had abusers park outside the house of the woman and play loud music the whole night for 3 nights in a row. And so when she went to court, she functioned very poorly. And degradation is the word we use for psychological abuse. We use the term degradation because the function of this kind of abuse is to shatter the core of the victim so that she no longer feels that she exists. She doesn't know who she is. Psychological abuse sort of, gets at this idea that she gets hurt, but it's not just hurting the woman, it's destroying, or the man or the individual, destroying their core and reducing their self-esteem so that they don't think they can make a change. They don't know who to ask for help, and they sometimes stop thinking that they're really even worth asking for help. It destroys hope. And once it destroys hope, you become more and more paralyzed. Intimidation is perhaps the one thing we all do know how to measure, and it's the creation of fear. In my work, we also measure the creation of anxiety. Why is that important? If you're afraid all the time, you just shut down and give up, and people will actually notice that something is very, very wrong. But if you're anxious, it means you're afraid that something bad will happen, but you think you may have the power to stop it. So what do? Well, you become more submissive. Creation of anxiety is actually far more powerful than the creation of fear. And so you'll find that most abusers create anxiety, and they do it by being unpredictable, unreliable. For example, microregulation, surveillance creates intense anxiety, and it really gets survivors to become more submissive and more dependent while not realizing why or blaming themselves. I'm doing all these things because I'm anxious, but he didn't really do anything to make me anxious. And in fact, if you measure it, it's not true. He did. It doesn't always have to have physical violence. It's easiest with. But in many cases, what I find and what you probably have experienced is this violence and then long periods of all these other tactics and then violence again, but it's not violence all the time. Threats of force, lots of past referencing. We've all experienced this. If you don't do it this way, remember what I did. The remember what I did could be a glance, could be a gesture, could be a referencing of an object, a place. Remember what happened in the parking lot. And it can be extremely powerful, but again, easily undetected if you don't ask, how did he create the fear or dread? Manipulation is messy. It's hard to measure. My students and I keep changing the definitions and what counts as manipulation. We argue with ourselves, and we've kind of settled on this definition that we're giving that's held up now for the past 3 or 4 years, is it makes something seem like it is when it's not. It's a distortion of reality, and that distortion of reality benefits the abuser and harms the victim. So we all distort reality. What makes something manipulative? It's when it helps the person distorting but harms the other. These are just different ways of rewriting the narrative. Outright lying, gaslighting, of course, is rewriting the narrative. And in manipulation, what is a very powerful tool is using rewards and punishment. So for example, you were flirting. No, I wasn't. Yes, you were. No, I wasn't. He goes on and on. This is an actual client. Finally, in exhaustion, she's like, yes, fine, I was flirting. He then says, since you were flirting, apologize. And her choice is to keep fighting, so she apologizes. He then rewards her and says, look, baby, if you told me this, 3 hours ago, we wouldn't have fought. He's just rewritten the reality that she did flirt and she apologized. A few days later, he started saying, you said you were a flirt, so I don't want you to talk to men. Right? So he uses the reward and punishment to rewrite her reality and trap her. It's a very powerful technique, and we've all seen it a great deal. And that was the example I just gave you. Just going to scroll through it, but not. And it had all these elements that I've talked about. He harangued her, and then he started to micro-regulate her. Then he started to surveil her, but I didn't put it up here. And then he started to gaslight her. And he then said, I have the right to do all these things. And he began to isolate her. So from being this very confident woman who had a great job, she slowly lost all her friends and eventually was living in a completely isolated way, with no friends, no eye contact, not trusting herself, completely humiliated. And it didn't end well. And then many years later, it ended well. So just to give you a sample of what a tactic can do is she gave in to him, and then she became more and more afraid, so she couldn't act. And this would show up later on. And why didn't you call the police? Why were you so slow in discussing these things? She really doubted her own reality. And she wasn't sure if things had happened the way she thought they happened, because why would anyone be so crazy? So either he's right or she's right. And after months of this intensity, she was afraid. She became so paralyzed, he ended up doing everything. And so she actually inadvertently, not meaning to, gave up her own autonomy more and more. So childcare, groceries, that sort of thing. And ultimately, she was trapped in the relationship, and through her actions validated him as correct. So he would frequently point out that he was only doing these things because she was a flirt and because she was young, and young women are flirtatious, but time to stop. And he was setting her on the right path. And, now that she behaved the way he wanted, because they'd been so noble and so honorable in letting her know everything was going well, it wasn't. It was going horribly for her. It was only benefiting him. Sexual abuse is invisible. And why is it invisible? The most obvious reason is it frequently happens in the bedroom. But equally important is she doesn't have language to describe it. I recently worked with someone who said, I know it wasn't consensual, but because something isn't consensual, is it rape? I didn't think it was rape, so I kept it to myself for 5 years. And then she described something, that used force, restraint, led to bleeding and injury. The lawyers in the house will know that that is sexual assault. She didn't know the law. And why should she? And what it did to her is she became very confused and overwhelmed, still is. And, did this really happen? Why did it happen? And then rape leads, the loss of bodily autonomy in all of us leads automatically to shame. If we feel we can't control what happens to our body, we start to feel extremely ashamed and paralyzed. We cover up the abuse, and it feeds back into the loss of agency and self-blame. And so I want to kind of give you an overall picture. When these 8, not all of them will happen, but when they happen in and out, let's say in a 2-year relationship, often the victim is hesitant, she's silent, she's anxious, she's experienced all kinds of harassments and regulation, she's paralyzed by the abuse, she doesn't know how to talk about it, she's humiliated, or they're humiliated. At this point, she's isolated materially, but also perhaps in her head, and a great deal of this has not been detected. But there's also a long period of 3 months where he wooed her and said he really, really, really loved her. And there's long periods of time, and I'm not going to talk about that today, where she thinks, but if I just get it right, maybe we can go back to those first 3 months. Sleep deprived, I'm just kind of putting these together. And then the big tension, should she have left him? Did she give in? But who was right? So you'll see these things coming together to really create a core confusion and paralysis. And it loops into the end goal, which is she's silent, she's dependent, and he's correct. So, oops, sorry. Let's go back. I'll turn it back to Leslie. I just wanted to kind of refresh your memory. If you measure relationship history or predatory helpfulness and coercive control, you're far more likely to be able to answer these questions. Why she did stay, why she didn't report it, why she didn't tell anyone, why she didn't disclose sexual abuse, why she returned to him over and over again after she was raped.
One of the things I want to add to what Dr. Raghavan is saying is really emphasizing how important it is to educate people, especially in the criminal justice system, about the dynamics of coercive control and also about predatory helpfulness that we're hearing about today. And we've had the pleasure of having her lecture on these issues for many people in the court system in the past several years. But the reason why I'm stressing that is because it's not only the judges who need this information, it's everybody who comes into contact with potential victims, right? With potential victims of trafficking. I'm talking about law enforcement, about prosecutors, and also defense attorneys. If you can't identify what is going on with an individual who is experiencing this type of abuse and deception, then their issues are never going to be addressed in the courts, right? And also, if that disclosure or if that information can be conveyed, then it might have a real impact on the ultimate disposition of a case, right? In terms of possible dismissal of charges, or else understanding that somebody is indeed, a trafficking survivor and providing intervention or services for that person. So I think that this is absolutely critical in terms of educational importance of this issue.
I totally agree. And for everyone, for all of us that are involved in working with victims, we really can use this information. And I wanted to take a pause for a moment and after what we just heard and draw your attention to a really important piece of work that took many years. But the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges recently in January, early this year, issued a new model code, revised chapter on domestic custody, children and domestic violence, children, families, and domestic violence, and factors that, and really talk about how coercive and controlling behavior, what you're hearing, should and needs to be part of the record that judges are aware of when they're adjudicating custody cases. And that as I listened to what Dr. Raghavan was saying, it's a roadmap for judges, for family lawyers about the kinds of evidence that you need to put on. So if you're going to use the model code, and let's say you have a judge that you've given them a bench brief or given them a part of the model code, and you're going to say, you're trying to convince them that they should be looking at coercive control in these relationships, then as you build your case, you need to be able to do the kind of questioning we're talking about today to put on the evidence so that the judge has it in these very complex custody cases. Because we all know domestic violence custody cases are particularly hard cases for victims to win, largely because we as their lawyers don't know how to put on the evidence of what we're hearing described here. And we need to know, and I think this training, this webinar, and the materials that we're providing, and I'll certainly be listening to this again and looking at the slides, they're checklists of the kinds of things that we should be putting together for the judge in these contested custody cases involving domestic violence perpetrators and human traffickers.
I'm going to do this very quickly so that we'll have time for questions and discussion. The big sort of question is, why would someone go to this trouble? It's a long dynamic. It's difficult. Why doesn't he just hit her or lock her up, or why does he bother? And the simple answer is because coercive control makes, creates captivity, and it creates psychological captivity, which is very powerful. It lasts a long time. It really confuses the victim, so she doesn't understand that she's been trapped or he's been trapped. They believe that they're staying of their own free will and there's something wrong with them. And it also muddies how to measure consent, because they often feel they consented to do something, whether it was criminal or sexual or something else, because of the manipulation. And this kind of creative captivity, it creates this captivity that is affirmation that, he's correct. And often the victim feels love, gratitude, and I use the words of a judge of a case that was a long time ago. And the judge said, well, why is she a willing victim? And she wasn't willing at all. She didn't understand that she wasn't willing. And ultimately she looks non-credible. And the question that, is asked all the time, and if it's asked of you, why does she stay or he stay or they stay? Why didn't they report it? It's a very simple answer, because the goal of coercive control is what? A, that they stay, and B, that they stay silent, and C, that he or they are correct. So if they don't report it and they don't leave, it's because coercive control succeeded. It's not for any other reason. It's so again, to quickly summarize, if you get the relationship history, it's really going to give you a lot of mileage. And then the rest of it should be really thought of as a dynamic which will make a lot of these incomprehensible behaviors fit together better, make more sense, because you're really making the invisible visible, and ultimately explain better what, when you get all of this together, it suddenly does not feel incomprehensible at all. It makes perfect sense why they didn't call the police, why they didn't report it the way where you wanted them to, why it took so many interviews before you learned about the things that really happened. And that's
Dr. Raghavan,
yes.
how do you decide their relationship is coercive?
It's a difficult $1 million question. So I'm going to start by saying it's different for the law and it's different for psychologists. And I think that's very important to constantly revisit. And at some point, it perhaps will meet in a clean, neat way, but different jurisdictions have different definitions. And that's my first answer. So ask who needs to know. The second is it's fairly easy to know when it hasn't happened. So coercive behaviors do not make a relationship coercive. So if a couple fight and let's say it's male female and he says she's fat and he doesn't like it, well, that was really ungallant and uncalled for and entitled. Does it make him coercive? Well, the behavior was abusive, but does he control other things? Money, for example, decision-making, children, vacation. So when you look at all these other things and they don't exist, it's not pervasive. In other words, the behaviors that are coercive are not pervasive, then the relationship is likely not coercive. And it's not a cut and dry answer, but so look for pervasiveness. Look for negotiation. Did she say to him, "How dare you"? Did she fall apart? Did he apologize? So look at if there's negotiation, and if the negotiation ended with more retaliation, then that behavior is coercive. Again, that doesn't mean the relationship is coercive, and that's very important to make the distinction. I would also, a shortcut that some of my colleagues use is ask the survivor, are you afraid of him? Because if she's afraid of him, and then work backwards, why are you afraid of him? What does he do that makes you afraid? Work backwards to join the dots, because there will rarely be fear if the relationship is not coercive. There will be many other things if the relationship is unhealthy, dissatisfied, but there won't be strong, pervasive fear and a need for obedience. So the bottom line is every case looks different. I would ask if these behaviors are continuous, pervasive, how restricted she is in her behaviors, how restricted she is in her head, meaning she doesn't think she has the right to ask certain things or do certain things without punishment, if she's afraid of him, and if she can negotiate, and then come to sort of a judgment on this pattern looks coercive. So again, it's easy when there's none. It's easy when there's a lot of it. It's the middle ground that you have to be very sensitive and careful.
I have a question. Would you recommend, and this is actually to both of you, both the judge and Dr. Raghavan, is if you're a lawyer and you're working with a client where she is afraid, is that where you start? I mean, would that be a good tact? Meaning, I'm actually maybe asking more of the judge. If my client can credibly talk about why she's afraid, I'm wondering if that same approach to kind of backing into explaining as in your legal case why she's afraid would work in terms of convincing the judge as well.
I think that element of fear certainly goes towards confirming, somebody's credibility. At least it may be a starting point if the other features of her story are unconvincing, right, to a trier of fact or to the judge in question. But I don't know that always has to be present, right, for the
Sure.
affirmation of somebody's credibility.
Okay, great. Okay, we're going to do another poll. Thank you. After hearing this information about predatory helpfulness and coercive control, have you seen these dynamics in your cases? And if so, in which of your cases? Let me give you a few seconds to respond. We haven't engaged you for a few minutes, so it'll give you some time to kind of warm up. Again, about 29 or 30% of you. Any more want to join in?
Please do, because it's so helpful for me to try to understand where my research can be most useful, is to ask practitioners, what do you need to know? What needs to happen? This
Yeah.
is a little bit how my students and I work. What is the most applied? What is the most useful for the field?
Okay, we've got about, let's wait a few more seconds. We've got about 53% of you. Any more want to jump in? Still, the responses are still coming. It's very interesting looking at the pattern. Okay, I think Brianne will close the poll and share the results. So 68% are saying in protection order cases. The next highest looks like custody, followed by criminal cases, followed by divorce, child welfare, and then other. And for those of you that typed other or touched other, if you wouldn't mind putting some of those examples in the chat, we can share with people. So is that, Dr. Raghavan, is that consistent with what you might have expected, or?
I didn't know what to expect. It's very high in divorce. I mean, if you have this much coercion in divorce, it should be criminal, right? But it's a divorce. And I'm not at all surprised by custody or order of protection.
Yeah. Oh, we're seeing it in immigration, elder abuse, religious abuse cases, dealing in friends and situations, employment cases, small claims cases. I'm going back to see.
I've seen it a lot in religious abuse,
Yeah.
sexual harassment and the workplace also.
Yeah.
It's not applied. It is applied, but not maybe so directly. Yeah.
Yeah. Visitation orders, economic related cases, foreclosure and bankruptcy. So we're getting a lot, really interesting mix.
Not in
This
my
is
real
really
life.
fun. I'm really glad. Thank you guys all for participating.
And like an aging broken record, the burden of establishing abuse should be with us, not the victim. And I think we can do it. It's, oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Yes.
Okay. Want to go back? There we are. I got it back.
Yes, and it's just to really encourage all of us to educate ourselves so that we start doing assessments that really get at the experience of the victim.
And just so you know, Dr. Raghavan, in the comment you made about criminal, people in the chat are saying it would be a game changer if it was considered criminal in divorce cases, which I think is really what this training is all about. And I think it sets us up very nicely for where we're going to go next. I want to make sure you finished on this slide before I move, though.
I am done. Yes, I think I've said it enough times.
So how could you get evidence? That's exactly where we're moving. How do you get evidence of coercive control, predatory helpfulness into court? Okay.
I think this is a question that we would want to ask Dr. Raghavan, since she has testified on numerous occasions, right, as an expert witness.
Sure. So my goal is for lawyers to, I meet with hundreds of lawyers every few months in New York City. And my goal with them, and it's been very successful, is for them to do their own evaluations, because what the law needs is not at the level of, I'm going to say, psychodynamic detail as to what I would get. And you cannot have an expert in every case. It's too expensive. It's not efficient. Sometimes it's not necessary. So I think, I think lawyers, I think advocates working for lawyers, paralegals should start doing these interviews at a basic screening level. It doesn't need to be in depth the way I'm doing it, because really what you need to know is, was there an exploitation, imbalance of power? If so, how did it happen? How did the person do it? And what sustained it, right? And I'm also working with my students to put out a measure, but that'll be like, probably a year from now, that anyone who hasn't done graduate school psychology can use. So I think lawyers should do it and figure out what level of detail you need your case.
Mm.
Now, when it starts to get a little complicated, then you call in an expert, but it, hopefully that would only happen, I don't know, 10% of the time.
Right. And my experience is that when you do call in an expert in some of these complex, let's say domestic violence, highly contested cases, after the evaluation is shared in discovery, the other side often collapses and you often get a settlement, which is great. But if we could find ways to do this and ways to educate judges about these dynamics, by using these kind of tools that we're talking about today and kind of building the evidence in your case to show this, and then sharing. I mean, Dr. Raghavan is published on this. There are published papers and articles. Judge Sarita, I would imagine that if I were a lawyer and I was trying to put this evidence on myself, I assume I could potentially do a bench brief for the judge to help them. If I have a judge that maybe isn't aware of these issues, and I could cite the model code chapter, I could cite this webinar. I mean, do you think that would be a useful approach, and any others you might suggest?
I would have to think about that and get back to you.
Okay, sorry. Okay.
That's okay.
I think in family court cases, I've done bench briefs where I'm taking the published articles and provide them to judges. So that may be a tactic you could use. Yeah.
I'm just noticing, I'm so sorry, Leslie. I just got a little bit diverted for a second. I'm just looking at the time right now.
Yeah, we need to.
It's 4:23. So just to keep that in mind.
Okay.
So this is a 12-question screener that survivors that Inderjit Basra worked with helped create, and they felt that these questions, and these were sex trafficking survivors, they felt that these questions comprehensively covered their very different experiences. So we provide it for you. Please use it and adapt it in the way that you need if you're working in a divorce case or some other kind of exploitation case. And that's all I'm saying about it.
So I guess if there's any other comments on why we really think, I think we've covered this. Anything else you want to add, Judge Sarita?
No, I think we've done a pretty good job of covering all the bases so far.
Okay.
Tell it like it really happened. That's our job, right? We want to really, all of us, we want to tell the victim's story in the best way possible that's effective for the victim, while we get data that we could still use for the purpose that we want. So I end on that note.
Yeah. And I just want to say we typed up the screen version of these questions. Let me see if I can find them again. Are here, but we've typed it up in an easier to read version that comes right out of the published article that we're citing. And it's going to be one of the handouts for you to use as part of the materials in this training. And there's also, we have like 5 minutes remaining. So I think we rushed a little bit at the end. You can contact Dr. Raghavan at this email. And there's also, we have all the citations to, like if you were going to try to write one of those bench briefs, the citations are here. And if you have any trouble getting any of these articles, you can call NewApp and we can get them for you. And there's a number of those here. And it's really good resources on this, very rich. Any last thoughts, Judge Sarita, any closing remarks, or or Dr. Raghavan?
I just want to thank the National Judicial Network for putting on this webinar today, and also a real thank you to Dr. Raghavan. You know, it's very obvious from your presentation that the research that you are doing is so absolutely critical, especially in the service of individuals who are victims of predatory helpfulness. I know that you have done so much for the cause of trafficking survivors. And for that, I thank you very, very much.
Yeah, and I thank you too. It's really, really helpful to hear the presentation and to think about how we can all use this in the cases that we're working on, and kind of empower us to feel that we don't have to be evaluators to go down this path and gather the information that we need to help survivors. And we should be treating this as important as documenting, as you said, the abuse. This happened this many times and that many times, that this is kind of the context and the texture, and it will provide the background that will help us be more successful on behalf of our clients. So I want to thank all of you for joining us and remind you that we're going to be sending out the materials. We have a web page with all of the materials, with the PowerPoints. It'll have the recording of this webinar in English and Spanish, and it will be subtitled with closed captioning. And you can find other materials at our network for those of you that are judges, lawyers, advocates, or law enforcement and prosecutors who want to join a community of practice or the National Judicial Network. We welcome you to do so. And please don't forget to fill out the evaluation. I'm going to ask Daniela to put it in the chat now, and we'll be sending it to you afterwards by email. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Judge Sarita, for leading this effort. Thank you, Dr. Raghavan, for your amazing research and expertise, and to all the students who've been supporting you. I certainly know how wonderful it is to have a team of students who do that work and to launch them into the world, as we all do. And thank you, Brianna, and for all of the support to this webinar from the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. And last but not least, thank you to all of you for the work that you're doing on behalf of survivors and for joining us today.